December 1942, Ansaldo Factory, Genoa. The workshop lights cast long shadows across the steel hull as Italian engineers circled the captured T-34 like surgeons examining a patient they didn't understand. The Soviet tank sat silent, battle-scarred, its sloped armor catching the light at angles that shouldn't have worked. One engineer ran his hand along the glacis plate, feeling where German shells had deflected harmlessly into the sky. Behind him, blueprints for the P40 heavy tank lay spread across tables, flat plates, vertical armor, designs that suddenly looked like relics from another war. The lead engineer lifted his eyes from the T-34 to his own creation, and the truth settled over him like winter fog. They had spent 4 years building the wrong tank. Before we go on, hit like and subscribe for more untold World War II stories each week. Drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. Your support keeps these histories alive. The engineers stood frozen, staring at the gap between what they had built and what they needed. In that December moment, surrounded by the evidence of their miscalculation, they realized something more terrifying than any battlefield defeat. Italy had been building toward the last war, while everyone else had moved on. 1938. Rome. When Benito Mussolini demanded a heavy tank, he wasn't asking for a weapon. He was demanding respect. The Italian Regio Esercito had watched Germany unveil the Panzer IV, seen France develop the Char B1, witnessed the British Matilda crush Italian positions in North Africa. Italy's M1139's medium tank had failed spectacularly, its hull-mounted gun making it obsolete before it left the factory floor. The Italian armored corps needed salvation, and they needed it fast. The specifications came down from high command like commandments: 20 to 25 tons, armed with a 47mm gun, crew of 6 to 8, top speed of 32 kilometers per hour. They called it the Carro Armato P, the P-series heavy tank. On paper, it looked adequate. On paper, it looked like it might restore Italian armor to relevance. But paper doesn't stop bullets. For an entire year, the P40 existed only in drawings. Engineers at Fiat Ansaldo sketched, calculated, revised. The design borrowed heavily from the M1340 medium tank, essentially wrapping thicker armor around an existing chassis. It was conservative thinking, safe thinking, the kind of thinking that loses wars. In 1939, as Polish cavalry charged German tanks and the world watched the old order die, Italian designers were still refining bolt patterns. Then the Germans arrived with a gift that changed everything. The Panzer IV sat in the Italian proving grounds like a visiting dignitary, all sharp angles and purposeful design. German advisors watched as Italian engineers crawled over every centimeter, measuring, photographing, absorbing. The 75mm howitzer caught their attention immediately. The P40's 47mm gun suddenly looked inadequate, a child's toy compared to this German instrument of war. Hitler's pressure on Mussolini to field a heavier tank wasn't subtle. It was a diplomatic reminder that Italy's armored forces were embarrassingly weak. The P40 design transformed overnight. The 47mm gun was scrapped in favor of a 75mm howitzer. A second small turret sprouted from the hull, mounting twin machine guns and a 20mm Breda autocannon. Frontal armor increased to 40mm, though this was barely an improvement over the M1340's 30mm. The tank was growing heavier, more complex, more expensive, and it still hadn't left the drawing board. Military officials reviewed the new design with the enthusiasm of men examining a corpse. They wanted mobility, not bulk. They wanted speed, not creeping fortress. The tank weighed 25 tons, but moved like 30. The crew complained the dual turret arrangement split their attention and their firepower. This wasn't a breakthrough tank. This was a compromise wrapped in steel. The truth arrived in the desert like a sandstorm. Italian M1340S tanks faced British Matildas and cruisers across the burning expanses of Libya, and the results were catastrophic. British 2-pounder guns punched through Italian armor at ranges where Italian guns couldn't respond. Tank crews burned alive in vehicles that had been obsolete when they rolled off the assembly line. Survivors who made it back to base told stories of shells bouncing off British armor while their own tanks disintegrated under fire. The reports reached Rome within days. New requirements flooded Fiat Ansaldo. 50 millimeters of frontal armor, 40 on the sides, improved engine, higher speed. The P40 was redesigned again. The second turret vanished. The crew was reduced to 5. The tank shortened, lightened, transformed. By mid-1941, a prototype finally existed. Actual steel, actual treads, a real tank that could move and shoot. But by then, the war had evolved again. The prototype P40 looked like an enlarged M1340S, which was exactly the problem. Flat armor plates presented perfect 90-degree targets to enemy guns. The hull design was conventional, predictable, vulnerable. Italian engineers knew it. The test crews knew it. Even Mussolini, reviewing photographs from the proving grounds, must have sensed that this tank would not change the tide of battle. Then the Soviets showed them what the future looked like. German panzer crews discovered the T-34 the way Columbus discovered America. They knew land existed somewhere ahead. They just didn't expect it to be so terrifyingly different from anything they'd seen before. The Soviet tank appeared through the dust of the steppe like an apparition, its sloped armor deflecting German shells at angles that violated every principle of tank design the Wehrmacht understood. The 76 mm gun spoke once, twice, and German tanks exploded like fireworks. The Panzer IV crews who survived the encounter filed reports that read like horror stories. The Germans captured several T-34s, studied them, dissected them, tried to understand the engineering philosophy that had produced such a weapon, and in a decision that would haunt Italian engineers, they offered several captured T-34s to their Italian allies for inspection. The tanks arrived in Italy by rail, still bearing the scars of Eastern Front combat. Shell impacts marked the sloped armor, but none had penetrated. The welds were rough, the interior cramped, the finish crude by Western standards. But the fundamental design was brilliant in its simplicity. Angled armor, wide tracks, powerful gun, diesel engine. The Soviets had built a tank that could be mass-produced by peasants and driven by farmers, yet it outperformed anything Italy had dreamed of creating. The lead engineer stood before the T-34, blueprint of the P-40 prototype in hand, and performed the mental calculation every designer dreads, the comparison between vision and reality. The P-40's flat frontal armor offered perhaps 70 millimeters of effective protection at best. The T-34's 60 millimeter sloped plate provided effective protection equivalent to 90 millimeters or more. The P-40 could reach 40 kilometers per hour on good roads. The T-34 maintained that speed across open country, its wide tracks distributing weight like snowshoes. The gun was worse. The P-40's 75 millimeters howitzer was designed for infantry support, not tank combat. Its relatively short barrel and low muzzle velocity made it marginal against modern armor. The T-34's 76 millimeters gun could penetrate 80 millimeters of armor at 500 meters. It was a dedicated tank killer, and it showed. But the chassis was already finalized. The assembly jigs were built, the supply chains established. To redesign the P-40 from the ground up would take years Italy didn't have. The British were advancing in North Africa. The Americans were entering the war. Time was a luxury Italy had exhausted. So they compromised, the most dangerous word in weapons design. Hitler's offer arrived wrapped in diplomatic niceties that barely concealed the threat. Germany could provide licenses for the Panther tank, that magnificent beast of sloped armor and deadly firepower inspired by the same T-34 the Italians had studied. German factories would supply the technical drawings. German advisors would oversee production. The implicit message was clear. Italian tank design had failed, and Germany was offering to fix the problem. For Fiat Ansaldo, this was existential. Accepting German tanks meant admitting defeat, surrendering the Italian armored vehicle industry to foreign control. The company's engineers and executives fought back the only way they could. They promised miracles. The P40 was redesigned one final time. The hull front received sloped armor, angled at 60 degrees to increase effective thickness. The turret was completely rebuilt with sloped plates, creating a lower profile harder to hit. The side armor gained sloped sections reminiscent of the T-34. The hull machine guns were eliminated entirely. They weakened frontal armor and scattered firepower, better concentrated in the turret. A new 75mm L-34 cannon replaced the howitzer, longer-barreled, higher velocity, designed specifically to defeat enemy armor. The second prototype emerged in July 1942, looking like a different tank entirely. Gone was the M1340's heritage, replaced by a sleek, modern design that borrowed liberally from Soviet innovation. It weighed 26 tons, reached 40 kilometers per hour, and mounted armor that might actually stop British guns. The Italian military adopted it in November 1942, designated simply P40 under the new naming system that abandoned the old year-based classifications. It looked capable. It looked modern. It looked like it might actually matter. The announcement came over radio, crackling through speakers across the Italian peninsula. The government had signed an armistice with the Allies. Italy was leaving the war. For soldiers in the field, the news meant confusion, chaos, abandonment. For German forces occupying northern Italy, it meant betrayal. Operation Axe launched immediately. German troops seized Italian military installations, disarmed confused Italian units, took control of factories and armories. At Ansaldo, German officers walked through the assembly halls where P-40 tanks stood in various stages of completion. Some lacked engines, others needed weapons. A few were fully operational, never having fired a shot in anger. The Germans catalogued their prize. Approximately 60 complete P-40 tanks, 38 incomplete hulls, waiting for engines that would never arrive. They redesignated the vehicle Panzerkampfwagen P-4731I and put it to work occupying the country that built it. The P-40S rolled through Italian streets on German orders, hunting partisans, securing supply lines, performing the inglorious work of occupation. The Italian Social Republic, Mussolini's puppet state in the north, received some for their own use, but these were political gestures, not military assets. The tank that was supposed to restore Italian armored superiority became a tool of German control. Some of the engineless P-40 hulls found purpose in the defensive lines around Anzio, where Allied forces had landed and become trapped in a brutal stalemate. The Italian turrets were dug into the earth, their 75mm guns pointed toward the beaches. Without engines, they couldn't maneuver. Without mobility, they were pillboxes. But pillboxes could still kill, and at Anzio, killing was measured in yards gained and lives spent. The irony was crushing. Italy's most advanced tank, designed to spearhead attacks and break through enemy lines, reduced to static fortifications defending German positions against the very armies Italy had surrendered to months earlier. The 24th Waffen Mountain Division of the SS Karlsruhe faced the British 6th Armored Division with 14 P40 tanks in their arsenal. The British came with Sherman tanks, thousands of them, backed by air support, artillery, and the overwhelming industrial might of the Allied war machine. The details of the engagement remain sparse, buried in the chaos of war's final weeks. Some sources claim P40s were destroyed. Others mention they withdrew. None claim they won. A single photograph from that period shows Hitler inspecting a P40, surrounded by generals and officers, everyone in clean uniforms standing in bright daylight far from any front. The Führer's face shows interest, perhaps even approval. But photographs lie through omission. They don't show the factories unable to produce engines, the supply chains broken, the strategic situation so desperate that no tank, however well designed, could alter the outcome. German Army, Group C, and Italy ordered continued P40 production, but insisted on replacing the Italian diesel engine with the German Maybach HL 120. The Italian engines were unreliable, they claimed, though the real reason was likely industrial. German factories produced Maybach engines in quantity, while Italian diesel production had collapsed under Allied bombing and resource shortages. The Maybach engines never materialized. Production continued, but new P40s emerged from the factory as hollow shells, turrets without hearts, promises without fulfillment. In the end, perhaps 100 P40 tanks were completed in some form, 60 with engines, 38 as static fortifications, a handful scattered across northern Italy in the hands of units that would cease to exist within months. For comparison, the United States produced over 40,000 Sherman tanks during the same period. Germany, despite facing total war on 3 fronts, built more than 8,000 Panzer IV, as send thousands more Panthers and Tigers. The P40 wasn't a bad tank. In 1943, facing a Sherman armed with a standard 75mm M3 gun, it stood a reasonable chance. The P40's 75mm L-34 could penetrate 70mm of armor at 500 meters. The Sherman's M3 could penetrate 75 to 80mm at the same range, perhaps more depending on ammunition. The armor was comparable, 50mm frontal on both, though the Sherman had slightly better turret protection, at 76mm versus the P40-60. But wars aren't fought on paper, and specifications don't account for the human element. The Sherman carried a 5-man crew, commander, gunner, loader, driver, and assistant driver. This allowed specialization, efficiency, a commander who could focus on tactics while his gunner focused on killing. The P40 crammed 4 men into its hull, forcing the commander to also serve as gunner. In combat, this split attention proved fatal. A commander watching the battlefield can't simultaneously aim a gun, and a gunner focused on his sights can't command his crew. The Sherman's vertical volute spring suspension handled rough terrain smoothly, keeping the gun stable and the crew comfortable enough to fight effectively. The P40 still used outdated leaf spring suspension that rattled the crew over every bump and threw off aim on uneven ground. The Sherman benefited from excellent optics, reliable radios, and a logistics system that could deliver spare parts to the front lines within days. The P40 lacked all of these advantages. And then there was the matter of numbers. For every P40 that rolled off Italian production lines, America produced 400 Shermans. The mathematics of industrial warfare are brutal and simple. Quality matters, but quantity has a quality all its own. A P40 commander facing a Sherman company couldn't win through superior design. He could only hope to survive long enough to retreat. The last photograph of an operational P40 shows it abandoned on a roadside in northern Italy, probably in April 1945, as the Italian Social Republic collapsed and German forces retreated toward the Alps. The tank sits at an angle, one track damaged, turret traversed to face nothing in particular. Wildflowers grow around the road wheels. The sloped armor, so carefully designed to deflect shells, catches the spring sunlight at angles that once seemed revolutionary. Inside that tank, the crew station remains where 4 men once sat, breathing recycled air thick with cordite and sweat, operating controls that responded seconds too slowly, peering through optics that never quite matched German or American quality. The commander's seat sits beside the gunner's position, a compromise that summarized everything wrong with the Italian war effort, trying to do 2 jobs with 1 man, hoping that determination could substitute for resources. The P40 represents something more tragic than a failed weapon. It represents the agony of a nation that understood what modern warfare required, but lacked the industrial capacity to deliver it. Italian engineers knew what the T-34 proved, that tanks needed sloped armor, powerful guns, reliable engines, and mass production. They incorporated these lessons into the P-40 design, but knowing what to build and being able to build it in quantities that matter are different problems entirely. Had the P-40 arrived in 1941 instead of 1943, had it been produced in thousands instead of dozens, had Italian industry possessed the resources to manufacture reliable engines and sophisticated optics, the history might read differently. But history doesn't award points for potential. It records only what was, and what falls short of what might have been. The engineers who circled that captured T-34 in December 1942 understood the truth before anyone else. They had spent 4 years perfecting a design for a war that had already moved beyond them. The P-40 wasn't obsolete, but it was irrelevant, which is somehow worse. An obsolete weapon at least claims its place in history. An irrelevant one simply disappears, remembered only by specialists and historians, a footnote in the story of battles it never fought. The P-40 never earned a reputation because it never had the chance. It rolled through Italian streets on occupation duty, sat in defensive positions at Anzio, faced a handful of engagements in war's final chaos, and then vanished into scrapyards and museums. The tank that was supposed to restore Italian armor to relevance became instead a memorial to dreams deferred and innovations arriving too late to matter. In the end, the P-40's legacy isn't measured in battles won or enemies destroyed. It's measured in the gap between what Italian engineers could imagine and what Italian industry could deliver, a gap that no amount of brilliant design could bridge and no amount of courage could overcome. They built a modern tank. They just built it for a war that was already over. The sloped armor still catches the light at perfect angles, deflecting nothing but memory and regret.